Expedition 44, here with Matt and Ryan again. It's been a while since we've been sitting next to each other in real life, so this is nice. We're here at Matt's Wilderness Retreat, Indiana. Today we are talking about something that hits very close to the book that was just released. Matt, tell us a little bit, give us a little launch into the book for those that aren't aware.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago we together released a book, Principalities, Powers, and Allegiances, which was based kind of off my dissertation that we worked hand in hand on as you were my doctoral supervisor, and we've turned it kind of into book form, and it's out there in the world now. We're really excited about that. But we're talking a little bit today about some of the topics that we cover earlier on in that book and how it frames kind of an Old Testament supernatural worldview. In the book, we kind of get into the New Testament about how that affects the way we live in discipleship and politics and all that other stuff.
And we have been doing a series of different interviews, Zoom interviews, and we've been working with InterVarsity Press pretty hand in hand for quite a while. One of their big authors is John Walton, who you guys know I have a personal connection with. He's been one of my life mentors. We're both really into Genesis stuff, and so as we've been going through with him, there's been a lot of talk about Genesis stuff, obviously, and the fall. And so what's interesting about John is even though he chapters one of his chapters to be the fall, he doesn't actually believe in a exegetical fall. And this isn't really, we're not going to speak too much about what John thinks or what he doesn't. We're really just going to kind of land on what we think of it. But today we're talking about the fall, and this is kind of a hard conversation because the word fall really isn't anywhere in the Bible.
Not in the text.
Not in the text. But most people, I mean, if you say like the fall, they would tell you right away, like
Genesis 3.
Yeah, Adam and Eve, some apple, fruit, whatever, some tree, they'd kind of, anybody, whether you're a Christian or not, would understand the terminology of the fall. So, lack of better words, we're just going to call it the fall, whether we or anybody else really necessarily align. So I guess before we get started, why are we tongue-in-cheek dragging our feet calling it the fall? I guess if you want to look at that, there's a sense of when Adam and Eve are, let's say, demoted, the fall would imply that they're cast down or thrown out. Downward direction, and I think you got to be careful with that kind of terminology. They're not necessarily being cast out. They're not even necessarily being demoted, and so we're okay with the term fall because we see this as a high mountain place.
Eden,
it's where the cosmos of spirituality sort of join, the spheres join, and so when they're no longer able, they're sort of exiled out of the garden, and they're no longer able to return, the natural direction that they go from there is down. And so down to, you might want to use like Tolkien Middle Earth kind of language, So they come out of the heavenly mountain temple and they go down to the rest of earth. And so because they're going down, that's kind of why you call it the fall. And then you get into, we did a long section on original sin. And so you get into particularly Reformed theology, and when they use the term fall, that definitely takes on a negative connotation of sin.
Original sin nature or total depravity, total inability, all of that stuff gets wrapped into those type of conversations there.
So Matt and I want to be careful that we don't necessarily see the fall in terms of that, but of course it is tied in with sin, and it is tied in with other spiritual beings. And so when we think of the fall, the two questions are, well, who falls? Humanity, and then we have spiritual beings. And so, do we see spiritual beings fall? And again, like, we just don't have the story. Like, that's not the book that we're given. And so what we do have is we have a beautiful story of God's unyielding covenant plan for us, but the rest is sort of cloaked. Like, we can interpret some of it in the pages of the story that we get. And I think I say this all the time, that when we get to heaven, like, it's going to be like watching more Star Wars movies of everything that unfolds. I hope we get that in some way, shape, or form, but that's not the book that we have. And so Walton would make a point that like we have very little in terms of a fall of Adam and Eve, humanity, or a fall of spiritual beings actually given exegetically in the Bible. So I want to be careful. You can take what we do have in the Bible, which is still good exegesis, and then we're going to kind of deduce what might the possibilities be. And we do have a lot of text that talks about the fall, and so we're going to go through some of that stuff. Matt and I often say what needs to be deconstructed.
Yeah.
Like, you know, what have you always known that is going to get you into trouble or might not necessarily be biblical? And when you talk about Satan and spiritual beings, I think most of it probably needs to be deconstructed before you have this conversation. There's just, you probably know more about Satan and spiritual beings from bad tradition, bad theology, left behind book series, movies, things like that, than what the text actually tells you. And so I think we need to first start out with what is a faithful methodology of the text.
Yeah, I think that I love that Walton's new book, we just had the interview with him, spends about 70, 80 pages
It's a
just
long
on
time, yeah.
methodology and that. So we kind of got into, we wrote an article together recently about some of this, and so we're going to dive into a few of the things that we covered in that article throughout the rest of this episode of what makes basically ways for a better methodology. And really, it could fall into three camps, and that's kind of what we kind of outlined of. So based on these three camps, there's different ways that they interpret the fall of Adam and Eve and the fall, quote unquote, and the, I guess, the dual falls is what we believe of the spiritual beings at the same time. We see them kind of both going down there. So
the first camp, you'd kind of have the people that want to be very traditional, and you know, again, I don't like to necessarily group them because I know different people change, but a very traditional group that says they're like standing strong, they're believing what the Bible says. And the problem with this group is a lot of times when they think that they're standing on the biblical text, I often find that they're the group that is actually the least standing on the biblical text. And so tradition, even though, you know, they want to say they're standing to what people, the populace think or what they've been taught, usually that's pretty new. You know, it's not necessarily, you know, tried and true. The second group is people that don't have a lot of great theological framework, or they don't have the Bible in harmony, so they read small sections and they get
text.
They get a great idea of this and say, well, the text would say this, but they haven't held it up to
the rest of the text.
And all of this weighs on each other. So, you know, you're going to find, particularly in today's conversation, that if you take one view on something, it's going to have to fit with another view somewhere else along the way. And then the third point is those that just, or the third group is those that just really want to debate. And, you know, Matt and I have been involved in seminaries for a long time, and some of our best friends are really into apologetics. In fact, this morning both of us are on a little apologetic like chat room, and like it was just going solid for like the last like 12 hours straight. And like we have a place for that, but there seems to be like a lot of like, you know, kind of going back and forth, and sometimes people just get stuck in just simply wanting to debate, and
or just wanting to be right.
So this time, what we're really looking at doing is just presenting some ideas and letting you guys kind of go with what makes sense and what kind of sounds the best. And different people have different theological ideas, backgrounds, things like that.
Yep. So let's kind of maybe get into Genesis 3 to kind of start with. And what we call the fall is kind of difficult to interpret for quite a few reasons. One of them might be that you, based on how you interpret Genesis 1 and 2, is kind of how you started and how you land there. Some of the others is based on the vocabulary of Genesis 3. So Ryan, maybe take us through some of that vocabulary stuff.
First of all, you have to figure out whether you look at the creation narrative, are you looking at it as a recursive or not? That's the first question. We've done a lot of films on this, of where you land. Are you seeing it as the same way you'd read a normal book, as this is part A and then,
Part B.
part B, chapter 2, so
rather
to
than
speak.
two telling the same story as one.
Yes, and so first you need to figure that out. Really, before you have this conversation,
Yep.
you have to figure that out. And so that's something that bears very much on this conversation. You're also going to get into a lot of different vocabulary, and I'd really say Genesis 1 through 11, you get into a lot.
Yeah.
And so it's not like the rest of the Bible. It's a sort of a separate genre than anything else that we have in the Bible. There's puns going on. For instance, the Hebrew arum is traditionally translated as crafty, shrewd, but then you kind of get into the root word where there's a little irony of nakedness, innocence going on. So I do a lot of word studies, and particularly Genesis 3, you really got to spend a lot of time in the text asking what exactly is going on. And then, you don't have any early punctuation in this stuff. The Masoretes add some of that stuff. And so then you have the question of well, if there wasn't any punctuation, how can we possibly interpret this? And there's just so much in the text that could really go different ways. And that's not really what this article is about. But I bring it out to say that it's
difficult.
It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And then you sort of get all of the extra biblical tests. And so, the intertestamental period, you're just going to get tons of commentaries of what they thought. And most of that's not really in the Bible. It's just what was in their heads. And so, you start like the Book of Enoch, for instance. Man, I love studying it. And there's a ton of stuff that's related to this. But
and the New Testament pulls from some of that tradition even.
Yeah. So they're influenced by that, but still it's not necessarily in the text. So the fact that they were thinking that way, should that influence the way that we interpret the Bible? And again, I just want to point out something else, in that we have this incredible advantage that we have the big picture here. Like no one else in history has had what we have right now. I mean, we can see all the text. We can see the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, how they were translating, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, this is just no end to what we have in front of us.
Cross-referencing Akkadian, Babylonian, Canaanite text, all that stuff. We've got the world at our fingertips for interpretation now.
Yeah, and so honestly, you have to, when you go back and you look at some of the, what I would call commentary language stuff, how much do you give them, because they were very limited in their understanding.
Especially the older stuff.
Yeah,
since 1950s, things have blown up since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. All the other archaeological finds of Akkadian, Babylonian texts. It's just crazy what you got now.
So talking about the fall, the hinge of this, the first place we start is Eve and the serpent. And so what does that look like? I mean, in kind of traditionalism, we say that the serpent was Satan, but the text doesn't necessarily say that. We've done a whole section on Job is talking about the challenger. I mean, how do you start out with a better understanding of the snake as a challenger, as a serpent, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah. First, if we see the garden, even as Walton says, all of creation is like God's sacred space, as the garden as the Holy of Holies, the hot spot of God's presence. Would God really allow an evil creature, if it was evil before the interaction with Eve, to be in that space? That's I think the first glaring question that I would ask about the text there is, do we really see the serpent before the temptation there as being evil?
And most people would say they don't have room for the garden having something evil there. And I would go that way too.
I do too.
I would say that it just doesn't seem like, according to God's order, that there would be a place in the sacred temple for something evil. But this is hard because the Bible doesn't actually come right out and say that that's the case. It doesn't say that there can't be something evil. And then we also have the tree of good and evil. And so if I'm playing the devil's advocate and saying, well, is it possible that something evil could have existed in the garden? Well, right up front we have a description of a tree of good and evil. Does that mean that the tree actually took on any kind of evil or gave a place for that evil to be? And I mean, the answer is we just don't have we can deduce what we want to, but we don't have that.
Yeah, and we'll get in a little later in the episode when we talk a little more about the tree of really what it's the trees of Tov and Ra.
Yeah.
And when you think of this through moral categories, yeah, it could be evil. But as Walton and many others have shown, that it's more about order and disorder than about good morality versus bad morality.
So then the question comes up is if the snake isn't evil at that point, is the snake simply a chaos monster? It's, not good, not bad, just kind of there, neutral.
Yeah.
Now, the hard thing for this, I'm going to keep going back and forth this whole video. The hard thing for this is that the snake is displaying, you ask, is the snake doing something sinful? Like a lot of people would say, the snake is actually the one that brings some kind of deception or sin into the garden. But if you look at the snake as a challenger, and again, we're going to go back into Job, there seems to be, you could call this a position or a place on the divine council of like a challenger.
Attorney.
Yeah, I hate the court language, but there's a place for it. Yep. And so, does God allow a challenger in the divine courts of Job and a challenger in the garden? And could that have been his God-given role?
Yeah.
And so that complicates this a lot, because then if the snake was just doing his function of the garden as being the challenger, of kind of challenging free will, was he out of line? Now, again, I have a hard time with that because, and again, we'll dive more into this, but it seems like the language of the snake is going to be missing the mark a little bit.
Yeah.
So again, we'll kind of veer into that, but I mean, we could spend a little more time on Job if we wanted to. I don't know that we need to.
We have a whole series on it, so
yeah. I lean towards just saying there's an article online that gets into, it's got
we did a whole article of Satan on Satan, also the Satan.
Yeah. So I think we're just gonna leave that and just say, you have to decide for yourself whether this is a spiritual being of the challenger or not. Now, Matt and I both kind of lean towards the challenger in Job, and
not necessarily being evil,
Yeah.
but being God's policy watchdog, essentially.
Exactly,
Like, hey,
yeah.
are these decisions the divine council is making actually doing the thing that you want them to do, God? So,
And it gets hard because are you seeing the snake and the challenger in Job as the same person?
Same person.
Now most people would say the story of Job is going to be a retold story that is very ancient. So could it be the same time period as what we would call the snake tempting Eve in the garden, if you're going to say tempting, although that's challenging too? Could it be the same time period? And there are ways to view it as the same time period, but most people, their traditions are going to kind of hold them from doing that. And so I'll just take a second to kind of explain what this looks like if you want to go that way. I tend to lean this way, just so you know. I lean towards the stories being very similar. So the time period of the stories being similar. Now, how does that work? Well, it would work if Adam was the first created human, which I don't think there's much of an argument to that. The Bible seems like it's got enough substance there that most people I know would just say, yes, Adam is the first one. Now, where you might get off a little bit is if you start to say that Eve is also the first created one, and that's where it goes back to how do you read Genesis 1 and 2 and everything else. And so the scripture tells us that there was none suitable. And so when it says none suitable, you kind of have to go back to that Middle Earth thinking, and you have to ask this question, like, why are Adam and Eve in the garden? And so if they're in the garden, are they in the garden because A, they're the first people created? Well, you might say that. That's a hard one in my book.
or the first priests.
Or the first priests. Or are they do we have their story because that's how sin came into the world? Those are all viable options for why we have this story, and maybe a little bit of all of them at the same time. But one way to look at it would be if there are other humans created and Adam and Eve come to the mountaintops to be priests, and God's going to have the reconciliation of the rest of the world be done through Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve are going to introduce God to the people and the people to God. And so when we read this, they're sort of in training, but then they're exiled before the training kind of fulfills. And that's why the rest of the Bible, we don't really read anything about them.
Yep.
And so if that's the case, you could have the story of Job taking place at about the same time. I say all that just to say, like, they could be
overlap.
the same.
Yeah.
And in fact, Job could even be earlier in a sense that like this is the challenger challenging on lower earth, the most righteous man on lower earth, and then he comes up to the garden to also challenge, and so you kind of have that, but then that's going to ask a lot of other questions. Well, then was there sin on the lower earth, or was there not sin on the lower earth? And then does that mean that sin's not actually introduced to earth? This is just, you guys see what I'm saying? Like, this is really complicated. There's so many different things that influence your lens about how this looks. And so I think from there, the big question that you come into is, was the serpent a chaos monster, or was he missing the mark? Did he introduce evil or sin to the cosmic garden?
Yeah. So I guess let's look at the text, and so Genesis 3 verses 2 and 4. Let's start there, because this is kind of where the serpent kind of gets introduced.
Yep.
And it says, and the woman said unto the serpent, because serpent comes ask questions of Eve, and Eve's response to the serpent was, we may eat of the fruit of all the trees in the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat of it, for neither shall you touch it, lest you will die. And the serpent said to the woman, surely you will not die, for God does know that on the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil.
So Adam and Eve, Matt and I are going to view this as the fall. Mm-hmm. And we might even say the first fall, although we don't want to coin that. It may or may not be, And so we're going to say, this is the fall that most people know about. And when we say the fall, we're just simply saying it's exile.
Yeah.
They're no longer allowed in the garden, so they're exiled from the garden. Now the question is this where spiritual beings
fell as
well? And does it happen here? Is this just the beginning of a long time that could happen? We're going to walk through this. And so does the language in Genesis 3, 2 through 4 sound to you like it's deceptive? That's really the question.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. It could. I mean, it all depends on how you read it.
Yeah,
is really how it is. Could the serpent be trying to trick Eve, or is he actually like asking a legitimate, question of her? We tend to, because of the traditions in which we read in, see this as something deceptive, like the snake trying to trick Eve into basically usurping God.
It's hard to not read it as deceptive,
Yeah.
and I want to go back to, I sometimes say deconstruct your traditionalism, but there's still a place for traditionalism. Yeah. Like if for 2,000 years people have been reading the text as the snake being deceptive, you have to consider that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's thousands, millions of people that have read this text that way, and when they read 3, 2, 3, 4, they say, well, yeah, that sounds like the snake is being deceptive. You have to ask that. Now, is there also a place, if I'm going to ask that question, I'll ask the other one, is there also a place for the Walton view that the snake isn't deceptive, that he's simply functioning as a challenger, or even a chaos monster? Either one of those, either the chaos monster or the challenger, could be non-evil descriptions of the text. They could be neutral.
Yep.
So do we get anything when we read this out of the Hebrew? I think that, again, like any of this early Genesis stuff in Hebrew, like I'm saying you got to be careful because of the grammar is not precise. I mean, like I like Hebrew better, but one of the things I appreciate about Greek is we're not asking all these questions. I
Yeah,
mean, it's pretty cut and dry.
Yeah, there's
and
a whole lot of evidence of how it was used outside of the Bible, where you don't have as much of that.
So you get this naked thing, and you look at that, and the snake, you could read that as without a veil. And so without a veil, beasts that are covered, veiled hair, bristles, quills, spines, plates, things like that. Is this without a mental veil? Is it
Like clothing? Is it like
Yeah, and so it could be poetic, I guess is what I'm saying. And you have to give that like just a consideration. And then, the revealer to her, closed eyes. This is Genesis 3, 5, 7. Orami,
when you eat of it, your eyes are going to be open and you're going to be like God.
Yeah, semantic oscillation. So again, I'm just going to say, like, you have to consider this, and we're not going to camp out going through this too much, because I'm going to say, like, I don't think it's going to necessarily lead the text. It might give you some interesting thoughts to it, but I don't know that it's going to, clearly say this. But when we get to 3:14, I think it's worth reading. It says, "So the Lord said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all the livestock and the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life." So when I read that,
it seems like the serpent did something wrong.
Yes. It'd be hard to read that any differently than that.
I mean, whether you read it in English or in Hebrew.
Now, even if this is a challenger, a spiritual being, divine counsel, although it's really hard to read that as a divine counsel challenger being, you could read it as a chaos monster that just didn't know any better. But it seems like the better way to read it would be a spiritual being that made a wrong decision.
Yeah.
I mean, that's honestly, when I read, like, I think of this of God the Father with, like, his spiritual being children, and he's saying, cursed are you among all the other creatures of the earth, so now you're going to have to crawl on your belly and eat dust, which is interesting. Dust, life comes from dust, things like that, all the days of your life. Life looks like it would be limited here. You don't read this as everlasting or eternal all the days of your life, which is an interesting repercussion thinking about spiritual beings. Of it might be a clue to your demonology thoughts or something like that. Is there a limit to this?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting is when you look at that the serpent is cursed, but Adam and Eve aren't. The ground is also cursed. But so I think it's something that we bring up a lot, especially when you're talking about sin and original sin. We don't actually see Adam and Eve being cursed. Which is interesting. So when we're looking at the curse there, why would this, if the serpent didn't do something wrong, say it's a challenger and he's just doing his job of challenging Adam and Eve, why would God curse him for doing the thing that he was supposed to do?
And we don't have another picture in the whole Bible of God cursing a chaos monster, which is also problematic.
So it seems like it's, from the kind of the evidence that we've kind of looked at there, it seems like that this was a spiritual being. We get into that in other episodes and other articles and that. But we also see that it was a spiritual being who was doing something it shouldn't be doing. So it was being deceptive, and God does bring a punishment on the serpent because of what he did. So
there's a lot of I think we could go back now and go back to, could an evil Satan exist in the garden? But we've done so much on this. I think we're just going to leave this one alone and kind of there's a lot of Isaiah references and things like that. But I think where we want to kind of take the text from here and kind of ask questions is, if this is a fall of spiritual beings, when is it happening?
When,
and so this is where our book kind of comes into play. There's a lot of questions that kind of ask this. So Matt, let's just brainstorm a little bit. What are some options for seeing spiritual beings fall? Let's just kind of talk through it.
Yeah, I mean, even there's some people that see like a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2 of saying that there was this prior fall before God created, like, separated the land and the waters, and that they see it as like kind of this destruction of creation and recreation, and some people will. That's the gap theory,
So if you take this, and we like to entertain all these things, if you do this, and I would have to say that, like, if you just walked out on the street and asked the normal Christian, when did Satan fall? I mean, most of them, this is actually probably close to what they would take. It's before the story of the Bible. It seems like spiritual beings have fallen. And sometimes people would describe, this is where you get into intertestamental period stuff, is that sometimes some of these describe like a whole war being fought kind of before the Genesis story. And you hear and again, this is things that people just talk about. This isn't really in the text, but you hear people come up with stories like, there was this great war. God created the angels. I hate that term. God created the angels to, kind of entertain him in the heavenlies. And then some became jealous and they rebelled against him. And some people would have it as a whole spiritual being war. And that's why then God created humanity as like a try again, or like, maybe it didn't go the way he planned the first time, so now he's creating other people, and now all the angels are going to sort of be jealous of him. So you probably heard everything I just said before, and you might even think that that's what the Bible says, but we don't get any of that in the Bible.
Yeah.
It's really a lot of things that are just made up. Now, yes, there are some extra biblical materials that would, perhaps describe something that you might deduce from that, but you'd still have to have a pretty creative imagination to come up with it. And
the text doesn't get you there.
Yeah, and then again, that's what most people think. So that's option one, is that they fell before this. Now the problems with that is it's not in our text. That should be your number one problem. Nowhere in the text does it say that. So that's the number one problem. The other problem is that if you have that being the case, then you have this person that you're framing as Satan.
Yeah, and you already have a fall and Satan in sacred space, God allowing evil into sacred space.
It's just theologically very problematic. So I'd say we like that option the least, because it just doesn't seem to have any real scriptural merit.
Yeah. After that, you have, I think, really, like, even when you look at Job, you see the spiritual beings not fallen, but partnering with God in creating. It says the morning stars, which is a word for spiritual beings, are rejoicing when God is creating in the book of Job. This story of, as God's creating, they're partnering along with him and celebrating, and so, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it is kind of cool.
But then you don't have any, I guess, notion or anything in the text that really says that before this incident in Genesis 3 that there was anything fallen.
Right.
And so you do have the serpent figure in God's throne room in the garden, and being, I guess, righteous or whatever, in good standing with God. And then there's this moment with this interaction with Eve, or leading up to it, where there's something that shifts at that point.
So I think just looking at that's what I would describe as a dual fall.
Yeah.
And that's really where Matt and I sort of land, although we're not going to tell you like to what extent that is. I mean, this it seems like you've got this going on, and then you're going to continue to have falls after this.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have the flood, you're going to have Tower of Babel.
Yep. Those are kind of the main three.
You're going to keep having these things happen where people are supposed to be partner with the God Most High Almighty, and they keep failing. It doesn't happen. And it seems like they're being influenced by something, and that's the spiritual beings. And so you get all of this, and then like all the way up until Jesus' time, you kind of have this influenced, and then we start to get into the New Testament, and you get some influences from there. But let's just go back and look at some of these texts. So I want to question, like, what do we know? And so this is one of the more enigmatic verses of the Gospel of Luke. Jesus tells his disciples, "I saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven." That's
Yeah.
Luke 10:18.
Yeah, so Jesus sends out the 70 or 72, however you want to count it, like 2 by 2 to go do ministry, to cast out demons, to heal the sick, all that. And when they come back, they report back to Jesus what happens, and Jesus said that based on like what their ministry was. And some will take this and say that, oh, Jesus is like recalling from his pre-incarnate state
Right.
of when Satan was kicked out of heaven, like back maybe Genesis 3 or whatever. So that could be an option. What are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
I think it's a hard one. So Matt and I both see a lot of different atonement theories, but we heavily lean towards a Christus Victor as,
Yeah.
one sense. If you have to take one of them, explain what happened. And what's happening here is Jesus is sort of setting the tone for what's going to happen. He knows what's coming, and so there's some words going on, and it's a clever wordplay, kind of double proportionate, that Jesus seems quite well known for. And you kind of get this language, "I saw," by Luke as apocalyptic. And so when you read Luke's version of it, in Book of Daniel says this kind of thing, that Daniel 4:10, 7:2. I mean, it's all over Daniel. But then some people are going to see this as a culmination of the second coming of Christ too. So how does this fit in? I go back to a couple articles I've written on what I call Jesus field trips. Like there seems to be, when Jesus is training disciples, he does it through the mode of a field trip. So like where Matt explained, like in this case in 10, they're sending them out, and they kind of come back and they're saying like, "Oh man, like we weren't we did it, but were we effective? I don't know." And then you have the weird pig story where that looks like it's a
casting out demons and pigs.
And then you go to the Pan of Grotto, and this is where
on this rock I'll build my church.
Those are all weird field trip stories of the spiritual, of looking into the spiritual entities, of spiritual beings seemingly to be important. Are they falling? Are they not falling? And so, getting back to the story, like, again, we just don't have everything here, but what I lean towards, and Matt and I even vary a little bit on this together, of just not being sure, not knowing, again, because you got to deduce it. The text doesn't give it to you. And so where I would say is the snake at the beginning may or may not be the cosmic Satan figure. We just don't know. I'm with Walton on that one, saying the text doesn't tell us, and we just don't know. Now, it does seem that extra biblical material later is also going to make that connection.
In Revelation chapter 12, verse 9 seems to connect the dragon with the Satan figure, the serpent. So all of those three kind of together as one person. This dragon, who is Satan, who was the serpent, connecting all of those.
So that's where we lean. We lean towards a more of a traditional sense of, in that first fall, that does end up being
was the big cosmic bad guy.
And so after this fall, then, is he trying to tempt the other spiritual beings? Originally, I think he's sort of a loner. I think he's sort of on his own, and sometime, it looks like that's happening. So then, Matt, you get to a Tower of Babel sense and a Deuteronomy 32 idea. What is going on with the text, with the Deuteronomy 32 sense of the spiritual beings? Are they aligning at that early point in Genesis with Satan or not?
I don't think initially when say Satan falls, quote unquote, that they're aligning with him. You do see, like, when Tower of Babel comes back and around in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, when God kind of disinherits the nations, divides them up amongst the sons of God. We don't even see that they're necessarily evil at that point. God is just basically disinheriting them, and then we see that through other texts like Psalm 82, that they do pervert justice, and they do lead them astray, and they do take the worship. And God says that, hey, because you've done these things that I didn't ask you to do, you're gonna die like any other human prince. And so God's pronouncing judgment on them through his counsel.
So it's kind of hard to figure because we're not given this. We're just trying to figure out what's going on in the text. But I mean, Matt and I would see it as like originally they're God's helpers. You know, the 70 nations are kind of sorted out. I'm going to go with Israel, my segula, my chosen possession. I'm going to focus on them. You focus on those, and then what would seem to happen?
They all come back into the fold. But it goes crazy. So
it seems like they all rebel. Like, for the most part, the people start worshiping the spiritual being in charge of them as God, and the spiritual beings would seem to just accept that. And then, in a sense, do you say that they fell? Well, again, maybe fall isn't the best word, but something's going on. Perhaps they joined the rebellion, but again, we don't know. We don't know if all of them fell, if some of them fall, when this is happening. So we kind of get the idea that Tower of Babel is going on and things are getting interesting. There's a Genesis 6 problem, which isn't good, which is going to come into play here too. And so there's just a lot going on, and then you get to the intertestamental period, and it seems like there's a lot of fallen spiritual beings that are influencing people towards, what would be demonic intercession, possession, occurrences, things like that. But it was also a very apocalyptic time, and so reading those texts, how much do you just read it as the genre, and how much do you not?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. So as we kind of keep going in this, I think there's a couple texts that we need to look at that might give us some clues into what actually happened in the garden. And people interpret these texts in different ways, and that's Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, where so in the first 19 verses there in Ezekiel 28 and verses 12 through 15 in Isaiah 14 are kind of pivotal passages that kind of look at, I guess you could say, the traditional view of Satan falling. And some will take the character here, I guess you could say, in both of these passages. Because what you have is, one is the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon. And they're, both the prophets do is they have this word mashal, which is essentially means a comparative story or a taunt coming from the prophet to these kings. And he's comparing them to something. Now, some interpreters will say that he's comparing them to the serpent in the garden, or the Satan figure. Others will say that he's comparing them to Adam.
Right.
So it's interesting. I think personally, the way I take is it's comparing it to Satan, and we'll kind of get into that as we go. But let's kind of look at some of the things that I guess these texts say, maybe starting with Isaiah 14.
Yeah. So I'll read this. It's very short, and so you can almost memorize it. You will take up this taunt, and that's the word mashal, against the king of Babylon. So let's just look at that really kind of at book's end, what's going on. The prophet is comparing the king's pride and downfall of that to a celestial being sought to elevate himself above the stars.
Yeah, that's what it says in the text of Isaiah 14 there. I think this is kind of an echo of the serpent's desire, maybe, to corrupt humanity's allegiance to God in Genesis 3. And so the heavenly being in Isaiah 14 is depicted as, maybe in the text of Isaiah 14, to ascend above, I guess, the divine council, placing himself above the other beings. But he's only to be cast down, as the text says, to the Eretz, to the earth, or you could say the realm of the dead, even. So the realm of the dying. So,
again, this is just the genre of his hard language, his comparative language.
So Adam and Eve were obviously kicked out of the garden, but the wording there, where it talks about being cast down to the Eretz, which it uses, or the earth, in Isaiah 14 is an echo of the language that's depicted, or that's in connection to the serpent in Genesis 3, and not necessarily connected to Adam. And so that's why we go that way, because there seems to be this direct connection even in the grammar with the serpent rather than with Adam.
Yeah. So Ezekiel 28 is extremely similar. Prophet uses the king of Tyre as a comparative figure in almost the exact same way. The king adorned with precious stones and positioned as a guardian cherub is described as a being in Eden basically.
In the Garden of God, it even says in that passage. And so the language, I think, is also strikingly similar to Genesis 3 and the depiction of other divine beings, even in ancient Near Eastern texts.
Yes. I mean, gosh, you could get into quite a few different texts that would kind of put creation stories into similar language. And, you know, whenever this happens, you kind of ask who's being influenced by the other. Like, when you first read the Bible, you think it's all original, and then you come to find out that it's influenced by a whole lot of different things. And, you know, this is one of those texts that you have to say, like, how much of this is influenced by other creation texts and how much is it not. But let me just read it. It's Ezekiel 28, 13, 14. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was at your covering. You were anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. So is that Satan? Is that talking about, you know, an elevated being that was cast down? Do we have enough in the text to, you know, give us a doctrine? Is that a faithful rendering of the text, or can we at least take it away?
Yeah, I think it kind of gets into, if we want to interpret it faithfully, you kind of see the thing that the prophet's hitting on is the king's pride and his hubris, and he connects that with something way back. You know, back in Eden, which I think is connected to the serpent, you know. Others,
that's what it seems like.
Connected to Adam. And I think there's kind of issues with it being Adam. We don't see in the text of Genesis that Adam wanted to rise and put himself above the council, you know, like, and that's kind of what it's talking about in both of these texts in Isaiah and Ezekiel.
So when we go back and we ask, could the snake have been just a challenger or a chaos monster or something like that, this is one of the texts that would actually tell you no, that there was a semblance of evil going on. And so it uses the word Hebrew ra, and so ra doesn't always have to mean evil, so you have to be kind of careful with it. It's tov is good, ra, they can be the desires of the heart leaning one way or the other. It can also be disorder, calamity language. It's also, this would be why some might just interpret a chaos monster because it's just in the middle. But the problem is Ra can also be read as evil.
Yeah, it can be both. I mean, it depends on the context.
Yeah, and so what does the context of this look like? Is this a Ra evil or a Ra just simple calamity, disorder? And again, like going back to the text that we have in Genesis of, you know, the curse.
Yep.
And then this, it definitely seems like there is some sin, negativity, things like that going on. Like Ra would be evil.
Yeah. I agree with you there. I think we kind of have this choice of how we're going to interpret these texts and the exaltation there. And really, like when you get to Isaiah 14, verse 12, it talks about...
read that. That's worth reading.
Yeah, you have fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to earth, you who were once laid low to the nations. So we have this image of, again, like, I saw Satan fall like lightning.
Lucifer!
Yeah, but that morning star thing, like when you translate it from like Latin in that, it sometimes gets translated as Lucifer, but it's really what Venus, right?
Yeah.
And it's about which was in the ancient world the morning star. In Revelation, Christ is also called the morning star, so it's
interesting.
Not. Yeah. So I mean, Lucifer isn't actually a name for Satan, though many have done that. That kind of comes from some bad translations in the Latin Vulgate. But
so I guess where we're landing with these is when you take the curse text in Genesis and you take Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 and you put all three of them
together.
Yeah.
Because they seem to be talking about giving us some additional information of what's happening around Genesis 3. You kind of come to the conclusion that the serpent was prideful in some way in Eden, usurping God, was cast down, did something that was not good, that was evil, that was raw, and so we do seem to, when you overlap those, get a fall of a spiritual being.
So every kind of theology is working through text, trying to use what we have and come up with the best idea for it. And I'll be the first to say, like, we don't have it clear in the text. Like, it's not something that we can just say, this is this doctrine, that will come. You have to kind of work through it a little bit. But as Matt and I have worked through this is sort of where we go, is just saying, like, it seems like everything leads towards that original snake figure kind of being described as the person later that rises to the cosmic forces. And
I don't see this necessarily as Adam trying to assume a place in the divine council.
Right.
I don't think you can really get that in the Genesis text, and I don't think you're going to get it here either in Isaiah or Ezekiel. Isaiah 14 verses 13 and 14 talks about the posture of the heart of whoever this character is that you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned in the Mount of Assembly. So that's the divine council. I will make myself like the Most High. Satan's the one who told Adam, hey, if you eat this, you'll become, or Eve, you'll become like God. But we don't see that Eve told that to Adam, so why would that be Adam's motivation even in the text? You don't see that.
So this tends to be the number one sin of wanting to become like God. And so this is hard because as recreated spiritual beings, in the New Testament, now Christ dwells in me, I am a new creation, the old is gone, put to death basically, the new one is here. So in my new creation, I am recreated to have the very being of God inside of me. I represent God. I'm very much like God, and I should attain in my devotion to continue to be like God. But the problem is when people have misstepped that.
Or take it on their own terms, rather than God's terms.
Then it's exactly opposite of what God is asking you to do. So this is a fine line. If you do it God's way, it's the way that God wants you to do it. If you take it on your own way to become like God, then it's exactly what God doesn't want you to do. It's classic Tov and Ra language.
It is, So I think when we get down to the end of these, I think when we look at the mashal, so the comparative story that the prophets are telling in both these cases against the king of Babylon and the king of Tyre, I don't think that they're necessarily kind of putting together Adam and this king, but they're saying that this king is being, and we even go through this in a section in our book, that he's being animated by Satan. So he's being controlled, I guess you could say, or he's following in the footsteps. Basically, when Jesus says to the Pharisees that you're sons of serpents, essentially, that these kings are kind of doing the same thing. They're acting.
So, is there anything weighing on the Adam? So, when you're reading this text, and are you wanting to put Adam into the text or not? Like, is there any place that ties into your theology on it, or why do people want to do that, or why would they not?
Yeah, I think that they want to put them there to maybe demythologize this a little bit.
Yeah, I think
I think that's part of it, that they have a hard time seeing a supernatural worldview, kind of in our post-enlightenment, mentality, our more scientific brain, rather than seeing things maybe a little more mystical, I guess you could say, of the ancient world might have seen, and we think that that's like below us to think that way. And put ourselves, I guess, in the shoes of the biblical authors and their worldview.
And some people get really into Adam archetypical language, and so that comes into play a little bit too. But I'm just going to say, like, this is one of those things of, like, do we have to put Adam into the text, so to speak there? Do we have to even have that conversation? Like, not really.
Adam was in Eden, and he probably walked amongst the divine council, but I think that when you look at the attitudes also, and the exact language that's matching up with what God says to the serpent in Genesis, it seems like a better fit when you look at the attitudes and the grammar for it connecting to the serpent in Eden rather than Adam in Eden.
Yeah.
And it kind of depicts a dual fall.
So Old Testament, this is really all we got.
Yeah.
Like, I hate to say it, like, we've been talking for 45 minutes and like 3-4 texts, and that's really all
Genesis
you can
3,
allude to. And
Isaiah 14.
we
Ezekiel
really
28.
could get into extra biblical language, but then most people are just going to say they don't care and it doesn't matter, like what everything else is saying. So you can trust us in that, extra biblically intertestamental period, like, they were thinking all that, but does it matter? Not really.
That's just how they were kind of dealing with these ideas.
And we like to think we're smarter than them because we have more at our grasp, and so you're still just coming up with your own plan.
Yeah.
So, but let's get into New Testament. So Revelation 12, again, in the New Testament, there's not tons of this
that's
information.
Back, you got that potentially that verse from Luke about I saw Satan fall like lightning. You have Revelation 12, which talks about the dragon and taking down a third of the stars.
So walk us through this, and I'm going to give us the simple version of it first. And so everybody just thinks that 1/3 of the spiritual beings are going to fall by Judgment Day.
Or way I've heard a lot of this interpreted is that when Satan fell, he took 1/3 with him in Genesis 3. But does the text actually say that?
And even what we get in Revelations 12, I'm going to say, is vague at best. And so there is some kind of 1/3 language going on there. When does that happen? Does it happen right before the cross, right after the cross? Is it happening early in the text? Is this the Genesis 6 problem? Is it happening not until judgment? Is this waging war yet to come, and that's when 1/3 of them fall? Those are all the questions that we're asking that we don't necessarily have the answer to. So how do we look at the text and try to come up with some kind of idea of this?
Revelation 12 is actually like a apocalyptic retelling of almost the incarnation. is really what it is. It's referring to the context is the first advent of Christ, aligning with his incarnation, his resurrection, and the ascension. So you have basically the birth, death,
women clothed with the sun.
You have Mary, which kind of then morphs almost into the child being Jesus, but then also the children of God, also the church, kind of being all like pulled into that whole thing. The male child who rules all the nations with a rod of iron. It's echo of Psalm 2, 8 and 9. The child being caught up to the throne is a reference to the ascension. So you kind of have all this. Heiser kind of critiques this, I guess, this fall being in Genesis 3 of all of the spiritual beings, saying that there isn't a single verse in the entire scripture that tells us the original rebel sinned before the episode of Genesis 3. So he says that is one, and that 1/3 of the angels also fell before humanity's fall or at the time of the serpent's fall.
So we agree with Heiser. It doesn't say that, but
the text doesn't say either of those things.
But we still don't know.
We still don't know.
What is it?
So I think he emphasizes that the timing of this in Revelation 12, where it says that the serpent basically, or the dragon, took down 1/3 of the stars, which we assume are like the other spiritual beings. But if you line up the timeline and the events of what's being talked about here, that happens at the incarnation. When Jesus is being born. Not back in Genesis 3. So that's like in Matthew chapter 1. So
then you get into Daniel 8:10, which is interesting too, because it would align with that, where the stars represent faithful members of Israel and they're suffering under hostile powers rather than fallen angels.
So could it be like exile or
Right.
the destruction of the temple the first time? Like could it be like some of that stuff?
So we know we have a degenerate spirit problem. So we wrote a long article on demonology too, and basically said there's all these different spirits, and I don't want to get way into that, but like that's going to influence this conversation too, because are they all fallen spiritual beings, or is there some sense of some of them just being degenerate spirits, like the Nephilim Genesis 6 thing going on? There's just so much we don't know here. And so, like, when are they falling? If we get the Satan figure falling, is he convincing other spiritual beings to follow? Do they fall on their own? Is this incarnation language? Is this Christus Victor at the cross? Go back and have some cosmic underworld war going on there? Like, we don't know.
We don't know, yeah. And so, like, if we look at, since we're looking at Revelation 12 right now, if we're looking at it as a description of fallen angels in Genesis 3, it's really a misreading of the text.
It is, yeah.
So
it's not
like
faithful.
You can't get there from doing serious exegesis of that text. So when people go and say like, hey, Satan in Genesis 3, when he fell, he took a third of the angels with him. Maybe, but the text doesn't say that, and you can't use Revelation 12 to get that, because Revelation 12
could be, but the Bible doesn't give you that.
Yeah, Revelation 12 talks about possibly if those stars even are spiritual beings being taken with him at the incarnation of Jesus. So that's kind of what we get from that text.
Yep, exactly. So again, like where do we lean then? I guess. So what is the best plan for other spiritual beings fallen? When did this all happen? Like, I mean, to be honest, we just don't know. I hate to go through this whole film and by the end of it just say like, we gave you everything and we don't know, but that really is the answer.
Yeah, the text doesn't say. All we do know is that there was a serpent, whether you call it Satan or whatever, that seemed to fall in the garden. Other spiritual beings in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of these nations, instead of directing the people back to God, they fell. They rebelled. You see that potentially it seems like by the time you get to the New Testament, when Jesus is being offered or tempted in the wilderness and Satan's offering the nations in exchange for worship of him, it seems like Satan does have basically, if you connect it to Deuteronomy 32 worldview, he does have the rulership over them, so it seems like these fallen beings are in league with Satan, and it talks about Satan and his demons, like that he is the ruler of this world, the prince of the power of the air. Like these ruling categories are assigned to him by Paul and other New Testament writers. So we do see that there is some kind of bad guy that fell, that he has minions, I guess you could say, and that's the evidence we have, but we don't exactly have a timeline.
So we have Revelation 20:10 as our maybe only source, and the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth. His angels are thrown down with him. And then we've also mentioned Matthew 12:24, Luke 11:15. Satan is the prince of demons. And so at some point, what does prince mean? You know, does that mean that he's, I mean, why does it say prince instead of king? You know, like, you know, you kind of get into minion language, you know, are these Satan's evil minions? Well, prince is an interesting choice of words, and we really don't get any kind of evil king language for the spiritual beings anywhere else in the text.
So, it's sometimes, I mean, you have to kind of make deductions and see what you get.
So again, like, where do we land with this thing? There's just not a ton of takeaways in the text. I mean, like, you know, Matt and I have written books on this. We've written countless articles on it. We've done 20-part series on inference from all of this stuff. And at the end of the day, like, there's just not the record, not the book that we want that tells us everything there is to know about how the spiritual beings fallen, the way that the connection between the spiritual beings and us, humanity, is God's creation. We can infer what we want, but the text, in a faithful rendition of the text, you can't just say, well, this is what the Bible says. I hate it when people say that, by the way.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
This is what the Bible, well, not really, you know?
Your interpretation of it.
Yeah. And so what do we have? Well, we know that, here's what we have. Let's sum this up. We know that at some point, Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden and they can't return.
We know the serpent is cursed.
Yeah, serpent is cursed. It doesn't sound good. And we know that by the New Testament, there's a cosmic Satan figure that's talked about all over the extra biblical materials and all over the New Testament.
Yep.
It's influenced by the book of Revelation. There's 1,000 takes on that, but whatever point you're going to bring that into the story, into a final judgment, there's a place created with the lake of fire that was designed for
Satan and his demons.
Satan and his demons. That's what we know, and that's about all we know.
That's about all we know. We don't have a timeline. We do know that there's a bad guy out there. There's a cosmic battle being done, but as we loved our interview with Shane Wood. He said that we need to live in the victory, because Christ has already won.
Yeah.
so that's
Christ has already won.
So let's not stress out about this timeline of when these things fit in. Let's just continue to live in the victory.
The craziest thing to me is that there's basically one text that calls him the Prince of Demons, and look what we've made out of Satan. Like, we've escalated this person to be like the superhero, like, you know,
Like almost equal with God.
Yeah, and it's just we're doing wrong things. I would even say with the text, but it's not even in the text. We're just doing wrong things with the way that we think. So let's de-escalate our thoughts of fallen spiritual beings, Satan, things like that. Now, that's not to say that Matt and I don't believe in demonology,
Yeah.
things like that. I mean,
Sometimes we just give it too much credit.
Yes, exactly. So this might be the most frustrating Expedition 44 video you've ever gone through. We've written books and articles and multi-part series at the end of the day to say, sorry, we don't know, good luck.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. It's good to be back with back in person.
It is
Ryan.
good to
It's
be
good
back.
To be back with you all. So may God bless you and keep you and continue to walk in the victory of Jesus Christ.